Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this edition of Long Night's Journey into Day. I am your host. My name is Pat Burton, and along with me tonight is my co-host, Leslie Smith, and I remembered your name this time.
Wow. Classic.
I just had a senior moment, that's all. And Andrea Parliament is our guest tonight. And Andrea, you may remember last week that we were discussing human sexuality and discussing some things related to just some of the hostility that exists in various, camps in the world today. And is it possible to bridge and to have dialogue in that hostile environment? I don't know. I'm a bit more, I think, of a pessimist in that regard. I think the only solution is the gospel of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And that we all, listen, I was offended when I heard the gospel. My grandmother called me one day and said, "Patrick, come and listen to this." And it was Billy Graham preaching from somewhere. And I listened to it for 5 minutes, and then I said, we called my grandmother affectionately, we have these little names for grandmas. We called her Nini. And I said, "Nini, I'm not really interested in this." And I walked away. Well, it was probably maybe 6 years later that I heard Billy again. He was doing a youth crusade in Southern California in 1969. And upon hearing him, I got down on my knees in the room that I was in, and I said, "Jesus, if you're real, you're the only hope I have in this life." And he came through. So the fact of the matter is that, we all, when we hear the gospel, we are confronted and usually offended by the offense of the cross. Because we believe that, there's many paths to God. I mean, I was into Buddhism, transcendental meditation, Buddha rides a motorcycle. I was into all the 60s stuff and confused out of my mind. And I'm not going to get into all that, but I mean, it became, my life was on the verge of destruction. And so when you hear the gospel, there's something about the cross that is very exclusive. And we don't like exclusivity. What right have you got to say that Jesus is the only way to heaven? Well, the right I have is that I have encountered Jesus personally myself, and I now know by the promises of Scripture that my destiny is heaven. And the only reason I got there was because Jesus died on the cross for me and said, "You're welcome. Whosoever will may come." But you have to humble yourself. You have to acknowledge your need for a Savior. And I've had people ridicule and just mock the term saved. "Oh, are you saved? Are you saved?" And in that kind of tone, and it really bugs me. And you just talk to a person who has been saved from a natural disaster, and they won't think the word saved is something to be maligned or mocked. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine's daughter was rescued out of a house fire by a fireman. She was saved. Her life was saved. She had to go into a bariatric chamber and to get the smoke inhalation out of her lungs, but she knows that the word saved means something. Well, I know the word saved means something because Jesus saved me from a despairing, hopeless, miserable life. And it was just as real as being saved from a natural fire. And he wants to bring salvation to every heart. And that's why we're here tonight, because we want to share the good news of Jesus. And we also want to be able to dialogue some of the more relevant topics that and issues that are happening in today's society. And one of the topics is this whole gender issue. I just read a story about a couple in the United States who the wife of the couple wants to put one of their sons through gender transformation. And the husband has said, no, I do not want my son going through that. The court ruled in the United States,
Texas.
was it Texas?
Yeah.
That the wife could do what she wanted to do.
Yeah, but ultimately the judge awarded joint custody, so the judge now, the jury sided for her, but the judge in making the endorsement has ordered joint custody.
Okay.
So they both have to make those decisions.
Okay, so then will, so whose decision prevails?
Well, I don't know, but the point of the matter is that the judge, in making the final endorsement, did not say only the ex-wife can make a decision about this child.
Okay, how about if she's convinced the child that this is what the child wants, then...
Well, the kid's 8 years old. I don't think he hasn't got a clue what he wants. You can look at
we know that.
No, but no, I'm saying because there's videos of this child talking about this. You can look it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Thank you for that input there.
Mm-hmm.
But even the fact that it was an issue really disturbs me. Anyway,
yeah.
Let's get into it. So, Andrea, when you hear things like the LGBTQ, RSTUV, and how many others there are out there, like, we know that homosexuality, whether male homosexuality or female homosexuality, is an act that God does not condone in the Scripture. Just like fornication, by the way, is an act that God does not condone in the Scripture. So I think sometimes the homosexual community has been used as a straw man to let all sorts of heterosexual sin go on in the church and not challenged. And I remember not long ago, and I'm not saying, I'm not saying, way to go, Pat, but I'm just saying that from a young believer, God instilled deeply in my heart from the time I became a believer in Jesus to save myself for marriage. And my first wife, we saved ourselves for marriage. We consummated our marriage after we made promises and committed our troth to each other. That marriage unfortunately didn't work, and I don't want to get into all that stuff, but my second marriage, we waited for that as well. Because I believe that the Bible, the Scripture says in Hebrews that the marriage bed is undefiled. And you said earlier, like I think it was the last time we were together, you alluded to, oh dear, I've lost it. Anyway, another senior moment. Having these
the
senior
sanctity
moments.
of marriage?
Huh?
The sanctity of marriage?
Yeah, that was part of it, but we were talking about the civil realm.
Oh, yes, we were talking about we felt it was a mistake that the federal government changed the definition of marriage in the Marriage Act to two persons instead of man and a woman. And I made the comment that they should have just created a civil union act.
Yes, absolutely.
Just in other words, just don't, your point was, don't tamper with God's definition of what marriage should be. But if you want to have two people of the same sex getting married, fine, but that's a civil union. It's not a marriage.
Yes.
Because God defined
marriage. God defined marriage.
Right.
Exactly.
I think that was your point.
Well, and to use the very argument, I mean, Trudeau said, the nation has no business in the bedrooms of the nation.
Right.
So, yes, exactly. That's the principle upon which we agreed that the state dealt with property rights, and the churches, as a general term, for spirituality is best governed by spiritual experts. So why are we taking, and I understand the motivation, which is that they want to have an inclusiveness. I was actually fascinated by the first issue, which is, why does the gay community need there to be a marriage? Why do they feel like they want to be included in a church, for example, that doesn't agree with the behavior that they're choosing to be? And I think at its core, it speaks to the Christian message, which is that everybody wants to belong, and everybody does belong. So it speaks to a deep yearning. But I believe that it's important that we continue to respect and uphold our Christian heritage, which is that there's a distinction to be made between what the state's interest in a marriage is, which to ensure that nobody's being taken advantage of and that children are well taken care of at the breakdown of a marriage. But it really has no business in the church or in the bedroom. And so depending on how you want to slice that argument, that's what bothered me, is the very legal principle used to defend the overturn of the criminality of homosexuality is now being thrown out when we want to go past that principle. That's the hypocrisy that really upset me. We've agreed to a set of constitutional principles. It's the using of those constitutional principles arbitrarily when it suits your argument that I find fundamentally unfair and hypocritical.
It's frankly, it's just like a lot of people in the church use the scripture to justify certain things that are unjustifiable.
That's exactly right. So hypocrisy, we all agree, is wrong, which means, you know, choosing the rule depending on what side you land on.
Well, the other thing, just to finish my thought there earlier, was that not long ago, in one of my sermons to the church that I serve, I talked about premarital sex and fornication. And that's not something that a lot of people are talking about these days. There are a lot of young people in the churches that are experimenting sexually, and they're not really thinking much about it. It's like, why not? And I'm thinking,
because there's nobody telling them they can't.
Well, you know what? My parents gave me that warning too about you know, and I didn't heed it. And I remember my mom very, very clearly saying, I'm not going to control you. You are an adult and you need to make your own choices. However, I can tell you, you're going to get the short end of the stick. And I can't tell you why or how, but it is inconsistent with what we've been taught or our beliefs. And of course, I thought I knew better, and it you know, 20 years proved that I was wrong. I got the short end of that stick too many times, and I ended up being in a relationship. And now we find, lo and behold, when a woman has sex, hormones are released and she wants to nest. She's just everything in her, and you're making poor decisions. You are no longer able to objectively assess the appropriateness of the partner that you have.
That's right.
And science is now exposing the fact that it's not fair. The men don't have those same nesting urges. His comes and goes quickly, ours stays. And I would never have guessed that. I was a smart young woman who figured I knew better. And when I had to look, though, repeatedly at the pattern I had created for myself, I regretted and kind of went back to my parents and said, why weren't you a little more forceful about that one? Which is not very fair. But back again to the prodigal son, I was allowed to have that experience and come back. And so I believe that my experience, and it cost me dearly, because I didn't actually figure it out until I was about 35. And by the time I'm starting to make decisions at 35, there's slim pickings out there for mates, especially those who want a 5'10" lawyer. There wasn't many.
I think the hard part of that is being the lawyer. I think the size doesn't really matter.
Well, it didn't help, Leslie. It didn't help.
When people introduce me to some guy, she's a lawyer, and I'm saying,
yeah, ixnay on the lawyer, eh?
Ixnay on that. No. And I just turn around and walk because what's the point now?
There's so many stereotypes.
Again.
And it's the same stereotype. People are so surprised that I just want to make dinner. You know what? I revel in my feminine characteristics that I feel a marriage brings out in me.
Yes.
And I longed for that protection that it created that I didn't even know I needed. And that's the tragedy, is that sometimes there's some decisions in life that you make, like accidentally having a child, that are so life-changing that and so potentially devastating on that child, on you, on your parents, that you really shouldn't go anywhere near. And a lack of reverence for the impact on that child. And I mean, my parents had 4 kids by the time they were 23. And were not equipped to be parents. Didn't really fall naturally into the role until they were in their 40s, and by that point I was already moving out. So I've lived, it's funny, people say that I'm quite conservative in my views, and I'm like, yeah, I was raised by hippies. That's what happens. You go to the other extreme because you appreciate the structure that perhaps could have been there.
To that end, I've been watching some footage on YouTube of children who were raised by same-sex parents, and they generally are not in favor of it. And these are the children speaking.
Right.
And they said that they went along with it as a kid because they didn't want to upset anybody, because of course that's the way kids are. They don't want to upset their parents. But now as adults, they're coming out and saying, no, it wasn't enough. I need a man. I need a dad and a mom.
I intuitively knew that because I was raised in a very unusual situation. So my parents are together till I'm 4, then they separate until I'm 12. And so for 8 years, my father was not in our life at all. And I wouldn't have recognized him on the street. So, and then they get back together. So I'm in grade 6, and everybody's parents are divorcing, and mine are getting back together. So, and my mother had also made her way through university and became a teacher. So we went from being on welfare and having no money to 2 incomes and a car. And I just thought I'd won the lottery. And up to that point, I'd always said I was going to be a single parent, and I was going to have 4 kids. And I, of course, because I didn't know any better, I had no idea.
That's what was modeled to you.
That was what was modeled to me, and it looked pretty good. Then my parents, of course, then I watched as they attempted to parent children without the benefit of co-parenting for the last 8 years. My father comes into the situations feeling very remorseful over this situation, struggles, gets laid off, struggles to contribute, has to start identifying with a 12-year-old boy who of course is in the "you're not the boss of me" stage. And it was a long journey. Now we made it, and I wouldn't change my parents for the world. It really made its way through, but it gave me a unique perspective about what is required. And there is no doubt about it that the gap of not having a father in my life in my formative years was one of the contributors to why I was single for 35 years and got married at 51 for the first time. So it did influence me, my ability to trust men, because I didn't understand them. I didn't have enough opportunity to see how men and women worked through conflict. And one of the concerns I was saying to you earlier about the definition of marriage is, I believe, I'm not against people being in a gay relationship if that's where they're at for their choices. I have a much bigger problem standing by and saying that that marriage that they have is equivalent to a marriage between a male and a female, because the differences across our challenge as Christians is to love love across difference. Love thy, I mean, Christ was revolutionary because he said, love thy neighbor as you would yourself. The Good Samaritan. We are to be loving difference, which we are almost designed to have a bit of a reaction to. There's a fear component when you meet someone different than you are. And so fear is where the devil lives, and we need to reclaim that the full spiritual journey, the full, complete spiritual journey is a marriage between a man and a woman, so that that child has the best chance, because I think we will agree that the best possible gift that you can give your child is how to have a long-term, fulfilling relationship and a family of their own. And we are not doing that in a marriage of people who share the same biology, share the same, too much sameness. I'm not saying, I shouldn't say too much sameness, but not sufficient difference is a better way to phrase it. Not sufficient difference for that child to recognize, wow, I really should be careful about choosing a partner. And I definitely, as a lawyer, cannot tell enough people, read more of those Victorian novels by Jane Eyre, because a bad choice in a partner is devastating.
It is,
And talk about lost potential, and oh, what a sin. There's nothing sadder than seeing people locked into bad marriages for long periods of time. And so for me, we need to elevate the sanctity of marriage, the incredible importance that it is to your spiritual well-being, and the importance of it in our culture for healthy children.
Absolutely. It is the foundation.
It is the foundation, yes.
And again, the voice of doom, that's not where our society is going. Our society is going in the opposite direction. So now we have people saying, oh, you don't even need to be married to have a kid. You don't even need to, you can have an egg and a sperm put together in a petri dish, have it implanted into a third party. And now we can have amorphous or whatever. Polyamory.
I mean, and it's going fast. Actually, I'm much more concerned about, I think relationships will work themselves out. I really do. And I'm now seeing a huge trend where in young men coming in asking to be protected under our, I think we have enough wherewithal to work out the relationship issues. I share your concern, though, over bioethics. Where you're starting to create the creation of life on a fundamentally different level, and the speed of those changes are, yes, I share your deep concern over that. Yes.
Oh, absolutely. And just going back to the whole, when we were talking in the green room before about the LGBTQ, I've been reading Douglas Murray, for example, with his new book, The Madness of Crowds. And he talks about there's no gay gene. He is gay, by the way, but he's smart and he's objective, which is very unusual. You don't get people who are prepared to agree with somebody's part of their message, but perhaps not the rest.
Sure. What's his occupation?
He's a journalist and an author. So he talks about the Church of Gay, and it's really quite refreshing. And he is gay himself, but he has real questions about this whole gay gene because it's never been determined. But he talks about how LGB, that is a sexuality. That is people who are clearly male or female. They recognize themselves as that, but they've made a choice to express or to have sex with people of the same sex or both. Okay, and those folks are quite different from transsexuals.
Yes.
And to my way of thinking, you know, when I look at a man who wants to transition into a woman, and I think about all the women out there on welfare raising children, I'm offended by that. I'm offended that some man can think that he can become a woman by changing his cosmetic appearance. I mean, that doesn't speak for me. I mean, a woman is so much more than that. A woman is a nurturer, a bearer of children, a homemaker, somebody who can work. I like those transsexual people, men who go from men to women, they don't speak for me. That's not my definition of a woman.
Right.
Someone who's manufactured themselves to be a woman.
Right.
Right.
Okay. So but it's very interesting because I think there's a contingent in the LGB group that wishes that T and Q weren't attached to them, because at the end of the day, I mean, what other all the lesbian, gay, bi folks have all the rights that they want. Why are they still, like, why is that part of the revolution?
Right.
They've already gotten what they need.
Right.
What else are they looking for? They get the right to get married, and they get pensions, and they get property rights and everything else.
Right.
What is it that they're looking for?
Right.
That is so revolutionary.
I think it's the politics of inclusionism that none of us should be left behind, that we're going to go after everybody that feels isolated and different and bring them in so that they can express themselves as they want to be understood and known. And I think it comes from that same drive, which is fair enough. But what I like about what you're saying and what I think is so important is we have no clue. We have no current theory of human sexuality. And that's what's missing. We are so into the dividing and the this, we need to go up to the next step, which is, now let's talk about because as I was saying earlier, Freud was the last one to suggest that this is how human sexuality is created and develops. And we haven't got much past Freud.
Well, we got Kinsey, but people are saying that was fraudulent research.
Yes, and yes, yeah. Or inadequate.
Yeah, inadequate and
yes.
Fraudulent research.
Right, and I think it's time that we need to start understanding. To me, I just don't understand how, if people can be sexually attracted to shoes, how on earth that could be biologically driven. So. I'm not too terribly surprised 20 years later that we haven't found the gay gene. I have never seen any study that shows that, and I am fascinated by this question. I am genuinely fascinated from a curiosity point of view. One of my first jobs, I worked as a counselor in a correctional setting in Alberta, yeah. And one of the fellows was transitioning there, and I was absolutely fascinated with him. I couldn't get my head around this, and so I would spend time speaking with him, and of course as a young woman, I was saying, so what part of a woman do you think is good? Is it walking down the streets and worrying about your safety? Is it the lower paid jobs? Like, what is it that you're just so darn attracted and enamored with that you would go through this process? And one of the things too that made me realize, now his name was Sheila, and I remember him sitting at the table, and the way he sat, I was like, wow, you are more feminine than I even want to be. And he just was so enamored with a stereotypical idea of what it meant to be feminine that I was looking at going, well, that's not my experience for being a female. So where are you getting that image or that stereotype of it? But as we progressed through the summer that I worked there, what became interesting to me, and realized that this was way more complicated than we're taught, which is that the majority of people transitioning, or again, I don't have statistics on this, but my experience, and I don't have extensive experience, but I have more than most, in the sense that I do have an undergraduate in psychology, and I did practice for quite a bit, for about 3 or 4 years. So this young man was hormonally castrated, in the sense that he had received all of the hormones to stop growing the beard and to start growing the breasts, but he was not going to go through the process of becoming physically castrated. Okay. And that is a very common choice that they make. And so there was an element of, no, I kind of like being physically perceived. Right. And the interesting part was the reason that he was in jail in the first place was because he was a prostitute. So he was gaining, he was posing as a female prostitute. Yeah. He would then get the men into a precarious position, show them that indeed he was not a female, and then he would rob them. So wow. This was a dynamic, and I was fascinated by what would motivate somebody to go through behaviors like this, because I'm like thinking, of course, that the goal would be to transition fully. Yes, yeah. So, and then of course the answer in my studies at school and from him through conversation was power. What he was actually after was the power of the attractiveness of a female. Yeah. So he wanted the ability to attract males, because that is a powerful power that we do have. Yes. A lot of women don't own, but we have it. And then, of course, he wanted also the virility of a male. So he was looking, and it was my first sort of clue as to why I was a Christian, because he was attempting to put together in sort of an immature way, I believe, the combination of masculine and feminine in a physical way, as opposed to a spiritual way, which is the mature expression of what we're all seeking to do, and got sort of tied up in that, which would be appropriate if you were somebody who suffered trauma, and he had. So he had experienced and had been abused sexually, and so he was trying to express a powerfulness through that. And so my experience with these other people perhaps lends me a little bit more to wanting to relate to them psychologically, because I know in many instances their expression of their sexuality is more about trying to feel powerful and heal themselves than it is about a permanent identity that I feel many of them feel like they tack onto it as a justification. When really what they're trying to do is heal themselves. Yes.
Well, I think the research now is that people who are transsexual or whatever have had trauma in their background.
I wouldn't be surprised if there's a very high correlation.
There's from 30 years ago there was research by a doctor in New York City, and he was dealing with obese people. Same thing.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, for sure.
And so that's what the current research is now, is that these people who deliberately distort their bodies by eating too much, so they become one of the research, I forget his name, but he talks about how women who are gay and they deliberately put on weight and they don't take care of themselves, they abandon the feminine look, they repel against it. Yes. And usually there's some background of male sexually abusing. Yeah. And so I'm going to just do whatever I can to make myself completely unattractive.
Yes. And I can relate to that, because I was somebody who grew up very fast and went through a period of that myself, where I was not comfortable with the amount of sexual attraction I was receiving. I was not mature enough. Not having a father in my life early on in my childhood meant I had a gap. And insecurity. Yeah. And that very insecurity made me attractive to insecure males who could see that I was anxious to please. Yeah. I was insecure, didn't know my own strengths and beauty and strength. I mean, women gain their sexual power so early and so easily. I mean, we start to menstruate, we become women. Men, on the other hand, have to earn their masculinity. And they do that through conquest. They do that through, we used to have rituals. I'm actually a big believer that I think we should go back to the days where young men, instead of trying to prove the entry into masculinity through ridiculous, and it is ridiculous and out of control, sexuality, the promiscuity, do it through tests of their integrity, tests of their intellect or physical prowess, however we want to do it. But I think it's time to look back on those older traditions.
Rites of passage.
Rites of passage, exactly.
And but I think you're right. I think we need to elevate the conversation about sex way above where it is.
Yes.
And bring back the biblical perspective.
Yes.
The biblical, not a theory isn't the right word, but
starting point.
What did God say about sex? What is the point of it?
Yes, and if God is a kind God, and I argue that He is, then why would He be saying it's a sin? So let's just put aside the issue of trying to challenge and you're not the boss of me arguments, but let's assume it was done in a loving, generous way. Is there a message there that we can try to understand and unpack?
In the boundaries that He has set around sexual expression.
That's exactly right.
I would have had a childhood like yours and a teenagehood and a young adulthood like yours, just to go with anybody, trying to find a relationship.
Right.
Exactly the wrong way around.
Right.
And had nothing to show for it, still have nothing to show for it.
Right.
Right? So, you know, and I was just told, well, you know, why the guy, if you give in to him, well, why is he going to marry you? You know, what was the saying? My dad said something about a cow.
Yes. Why
buy the cow when you get the milk for free or something?
That's right.
And I thought that was ridiculous. But that was his way of saying, well, not very well. Nobody ever framed it for me in the context of what is a marriage between a male and a female in God's way, and how powerful sex is.
Yes.
And what is it, a holy act between a man and a woman who are married to each other.
Yes.
And so we've devalued it now, and it's just a transaction.
Yes.
I heard it.
It's just a transaction.
Yeah.
And let me say how tragic that is how tragic it is that in the name of probably feminism, because my mother was definitely a feminist and encouraged and told me, you can do anything you want, and really didn't understand. I mean, she had 4 kids by the time she was 23, so of course she looks at me and says, you can do what you want. But no, I couldn't do what I want, and I got a little anger against the feminist movement that basically sort of threw me out there, saying, "Hey, you can make decisions that are good enough for yourself. Women want sex just as much as men do." That's not true. That's just not true, and it's not wise. And I had no skill set. I had a big gap in how I saw myself, and of course we're trying to protect young girls from the you were talking earlier about where do we talk about these things, and we're trying to protect our young girls because there certainly is an age where it's not appropriate to have those discussions. And the problem with, of course, institutions having these discussions is it just sort of assumes that everybody's ready for that discussion at the same time, which is not. If you've come from a bad background like I did, and I don't know if I'm assuming that for you, but we needed to be treated individually for our own unique situations, and the cost that we've paid is I mean, I don't have children because of that, and it was a horrifying thing for me to come to. I mean, I have my own practice and it's successful, but that was my what do you call that on a game show when you get the consolation prize? You know, it wasn't the main event by a long stretch. And part of me, for returning to my Christian roots with so much more enthusiasm and respect, comes from wishing that I had not bought into so much of that feminism argument, because I was not able to make good decisions for myself.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I came from a great home, but my take on it is that I think Satan just gets into people. Like I feel that God had a big plan for me. Yes. And I think Satan knew it, and I think he just went in and just sowed a lot of restlessness in me, and criticism of us. My parents had a very stable marriage, and they were married to each other, and they waited and so forth. And I just thought that looked really boring. Right. And so I just said, I'm just going to do what I want. No humility. It was the Church of Leslie. Mm-hmm. And, I was the God of myself, and too bad for you, and this is very boring and traditional. I'm going to do what I like. And, and I have paid the price for that. Right.
Yes.
Big time.
I heard one gentleman one time say that premarital sexual relationship can be likened to wanting the privilege of marriage before the commitment of marriage.
Yeah, of course.
And that
Absolutely.
was a very, very true statement.
Yeah.
And I think what I'd like to just sort of touch on is what both you and Leslie said. You talked about and related to the hormonal change that this person was going through, this male wanting to be a female. And you were talking about the more of the superficial, like the cosmetic look to try to attain something. And this is what came to my mind. God created male and